Thanks everybody for joining with us today. My name is Caleb Corwin. I'm a psychologist at the Center of Excellence for Children in State Custody. There are 5 centers of excellence across the state. I'm at the one here in Knoxville, housed at the University of Tennessee Health Sciences Center. We've just changed. Now we're the College of Medicine, Knoxville. So we've had a little bit of a branding change here. There's also one at ETSU up in Johnson City, at Vanderbilt in Nashville. The Southeast Center of Excellence is down in Chattanooga, and then there's another one, UT Health Sciences Center, out in Memphis. So we're 5 sister sites across the state, and we are tasked with kind of helping to improve information and quality of services for behavioral health for children involved in child welfare or at risk of being involved in child welfare. So we do consultation services for Department of Children's Services as well as trainings. Part of that is we get to do these lunch and learns, which I think have been an excellent way for us to help get information out to people who are working to improve things for children involved with foster care. For any of you who haven't been here before, you can check out our YouTube page. We have some of our previous recordings. You can check out old videos on there. We've been doing a complex trauma training series for a while, and then we've been mixing it up every once in a while. And today we are fortunate enough to have Dr. Julia Thompson, one of our psychologists from the ETSU Center of Excellence, who's going to be joining us today to talk about recovering from disaster and speaking specifically about some of the recovery efforts from Hurricane Helene, which I think I'm really excited to hear. I know she was able to present this at a national conference for the All Network Conference for the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. And so I'm really excited to hear that information presented for our Tennessee cohort here today. All right, and so I'll turn it over to Dr. Thompson.
Thank you very much. So like Caleb said, I am Julia Thompson, psychologist over at the ETSU Center of Excellence in Johnson City, and I appreciate seeing some of my Northeast folks here as well. And I'll give a little bit of my background, which also includes some of Caleb's background. He and I both graduated with our PhDs in psychology from Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge. And our advisor did research on Hurricane Katrina, which is how I first was introduced to sort of the disaster world. And so some of these slides that I will talk about actually include, I'm giving a shout out to the hard work we did in grad school. It includes some of the data that we collected as part of our research when we were young, sweet baby grad students many years ago. So it's interesting coming kind of back to the realm of disaster research. It is generally not a realm you expect to be in, but get placed in unexpectedly. Turn that off a bit. And so yes, that's kind of where I have found myself in the past year with the kind of outcome of Hurricane Helene. Part of my work, in addition to ETSU, the COE, is I am now part of the Washington County Long-Term Recovery Group, which was a coalition that formed after Hurricane Helene. I am the vice chair of the Spiritual and Emotional Well-Being Committee, which is a partnership between mental health professionals, some of the spiritual organizations, and just community members supporting folks who were impacted by Hurricane Helene in Washington County. And so there's several projects that we have done there, and I'll try to talk a little bit about those as well. But I'm going to share my slides and we'll jump into conversation on, how we can support children and families after a disaster, what disaster recovery looks like, and how that impacted families in our area. Yeah, we're going to talk a little bit about disaster recovery trajectories, and that's where we're going to get into a little bit of research and talk about some of those models for a little bit. And, when we talk about disasters, we talk about resilience and what that means and what that looks like. And then looking a little bit more clinically at, how do children and families, what are responses to disasters? What does that look like? And talk about some interventions, how you support them, and then the recovery efforts related to Hurricane Helene. So I'm going to start off with this slide because I think it is, it's a visual. It is a heck of a visual. So this is a slide from NOAA that is a graphic about the number of billion-dollar weather disasters that occurred in 2024. And so Hurricane Helene and the preceding 2-day rain event that occurred in conjunction with it caused historic inland flash flooding that resulted in 18 deaths and approximately $1 billion of damage just in Tennessee. NOAA estimates that the rainfall totals associated with those 3 days were about 10% heavier and 70% more likely to occur due to current climate change. Helene was one of 27 billion-dollar disasters, so disasters that cost at least $1 billion or more that occurred in 2024, which was the second highest on record after 2023. So I think this just gives that image that these types of weather events are becoming more common. Now, the good news is over the last 40 plus years, we have seen a reduction in the number of fatalities associated with these weather events. However, we have not seen a reduction in the amount of damage or the cost related to these events. And that's something for communities to be considering. We know these events are becoming more likely to happen, and that they are very expensive and they cause significant amount of disruption. And that sort of as a community at whatever level, we are beginning to grapple with how do we start to respond to these. So FEMA has their National Disaster Response and Recovery Framework, and that's what this little graph here shows. And I like to introduce it because if you jump into disaster work, you'll probably see it again. And it helps to explain not only the sort of the recovery process from like a disaster management perspective, but also can help us understand the emotional recovery process and areas where families and individuals may get stuck or may struggle. So on this graph, you have on the very left-hand side, you have the sort of preparedness aspect prior to the event, which we will talk a little bit about at the very, very end. But it starts with, that when that disaster strikes. And then it gets divided into sort of 3 categories, 3 points along the timeline. The short-term national response. Those are the days, weeks, maybe early months after the disaster. You see that depicted in the red part of the graph. And then you have the intermediate response, that part of the curve. Those are weeks to months after the event. And then we have the long-term response. That's the green. Those are the months to years after the event. And what it's showing you with those separate curves is that relates to the size and scope of disaster and recovery efforts. So the amount of sort of response or recovery efforts that are happening at each of those time points. And there's several things that you may notice about this. We do see this sort of waxing and waning of supports at each time frame, short, intermediate, and long. And we also see overlap in those different time frames. So there's not a hard stop between the short-term response of a disaster and the intermediate, or the intermediate and the long-term. And that has grown out of research and field guidance on how we need to be monitoring and supporting families that are impacted. So we start off with the short term, and for those of you that experienced Hurricane Helene or have been in other disaster events, in that immediate aftermath, those days and weeks, there is a huge influx of support, donations, aid stations, FEMA, sometimes the National Guard, federal level response, state level response, community level, individual volunteers. We see that big influx of support very early on. And a lot of that will be focused on immediate needs, shelter, water, food, safety needs. And then that starts to die down. And then you start to get this intermediate response where you have your more kind of sustained or programmatic response. So this is when Red Cross starts bringing in volunteers to repair damaged buildings, or the state brings in folks to do infrastructure repair, road repair. And so around here, we saw a lot with I-40, I-26, this big influx of workers to repair the roads and repair the infrastructure. And then that starts to, as we start to get further away from the event, those continue on, but then you'll start to see those programs start to wrap up. You kind of get the basic infrastructure back in place, but then there is this long-term response. Now, typically it's not as intense. There's not as much funding or as many volunteers or as heavy-duty programming, but there is long-term response that might include things like ongoing case management, recovery and resilience projects that started that are going to continue in the months to years afterwards. And that is true to what we've seen with Hurricane Helene. So this is, that framework that shows what the kind of FEMA's response is, or the overall disaster management folks' response is. But I also would say that this is how the emotional response often looks at the community level. Similarly, short term, there's usually this big outpouring of support. Folks jumping in. What do you need? How can we help? How do we connect you? How do we get you safe, secure, back on your feet? And then, folks, it starts to die down. You see more of that intermediate where maybe it's increased access to mental health services, programming in schools to help kids get back into the school routine, those sorts of things. And then that starts to fade off and you see more kind of like some long-term programming, helping those more long-term needs. Couple of points to consider as we see that waning of support between each phase. This is where we can sometimes see families, children, individuals get sort of stuck. Some families, a little bit of help at the very beginning, getting them back on their feet, they're good to go. Some, when that initial burst of help recedes, they're kind of left feeling a little bit lost, a little bit abandoned, and a little uncertain of how to move forward. Same between that intermediate and long-term phase. When we start to see those programs pull back, which we are starting to see as we approach the anniversary, some families struggle in that transition. They were getting pretty good help, now it's starting to fade away and they are not quite able to make that jump. And those are places where those of us who work with children, work with families who have been exposed to disasters, want to keep our eye on because that can be where you can see families start to struggle. So I would argue in relation to Hurricane Helene, we are starting to see that downturn of the intermediate response and the more kind of long-term response. We've had the big push. We've had, a lot of volunteers come in, a lot of programming come in. We're seeing that that's about to start winding down with, especially kind of along the anniversary. But there are still programs that are out there. There is still support specific to the disaster. It's not completely gone, but we are seeing that downturn. Big things to remember, just things to keep in mind. We do see this immediate influx, the wax and wane of support. Families do sometimes get stuck as support is being removed. Those are families we want to check in on. We do see the overlap in the recovery timeframes. Not everyone will be in the same phase at the same time, and that's okay. But it is helpful to remember that families may not be in the same place in terms of their recovery from a disaster, no matter what the graph says. And then something else this graph points out, and this is based on what we've learned over the decades of disaster research, there is no sort of fixed end date to long-term recovery. For some, they're moving on, they're ready to go. For others, this is something that is very personal, very deep to them, and very challenging for them to recover from, and that's okay. There's no fixed end date. Just because we're hitting the anniversary doesn't mean everybody should be recovered and nobody should have any more problems. It is understandable and not unexpected that some folks will still need support long term. All right, so we're going to get into a little bit of the research here, and this is some of the research that actually came out of Caleb and I's program at LSU. Not the entirety of it, but a little bit of it did, and that's looking at disaster recovery trajectories. And so this is research on, well, what happens long term to people after a disaster? How do they do? And so a lot of these studies will start when a disaster hits, and folks will participate in studies where their emotional functioning is measured over time. So for instance, some of the disaster work that we did, we were looking at mothers and children after Hurricane Katrina, and we had about 6 waves of data, so 6 data points, starting at 6 months. It's like 6 months, a year, 18 months, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, kind of around that timeline. And so when you look at that, look at those patterns over time, what do you see? What starts to emerge? And so we've gotten pretty good data, especially since 9/11, actually, which we recently have the 24th anniversary of 9/11. A lot of this type of research started with 9/11 and then continued to this day. And one of the big researchers, his name is George Bonanno out of New York, who was one of the big researchers after 9/11. He's looked at these disaster recovery trajectories. How do individuals do? And he and then Betty Lai, who also does this type of work, have started to do some bigger meta-analyses where they've gathered all this data together and said, okay, what does it look like now? And what they've found is that you'll see 6 trajectories in this graph, but truly there's about 4 trajectories we find with adults of how they do after disaster. And I'll go through the 6 and then we'll talk about the 4 that really tend to stick out the most. So what this graph shows is that those different time points post-disaster, and what it measured were levels of post-traumatic stress symptoms. So usually these are symptoms of things like PTSD, depression, anxiety, other measures of emotional disorders that may occur after a disaster. And it says, how many people had what symptoms? And what they found is there were these kind of 6 different patterns. We'll start at the very bottom of the graph. One is what they call a resistance pattern. These are folks who never report any symptoms in the aftermath of a disaster. They report no symptoms, no anxiety, no depression, no post-traumatic stress disorder, nothing. And that stays true at each time point. Next up, we have kind of the gray circled dots, little dots. They call that delayed onset. So these are folks that in those initial time points, they were denying many symptoms. Things are fine, things are fine, things are fine. But then at a later time, like that kind of short to intermediate time, this would be more of that intermediate phase, their symptoms spike. So they're doing okay, and then all of a sudden we see this increase in symptoms, and they call that a delayed onset. Right above that is the black dashes. That's the resilience trajectory. So this is a number of folks will report maybe some symptoms after disaster, not clinically significant, not super high. They may report some, but they quickly come down and they don't go back up. So, okay, initially some symptoms, but it quickly resolves and then they do okay, no more symptoms. Above that is the relapse trajectory. This is the idea of folks who maybe start off with higher symptoms. They start to go down, but then for some reason they spike back up and then tend to stay up. We then have a recovery. This is kind of our lighter gray line. Recovery is they start off with high symptoms that gradually go down over time. And then at the very top are the red dots. That's a chronic trajectory. So folks who start high after the disaster, they've got a lot of symptoms, and then those symptoms don't go down. So when we look at those 6 trajectories, what Bonanno argues is that really it's actually, it gets pares down to about 4 trajectories that you see very consistently in disaster research. And that is your resilient trajectory, which also includes the resistant folks. So folks who maybe have some symptoms early on, but they quickly resolve. Then it's our recovery folks who start off high, but then symptoms go down over time. Our delayed onset folks, so start off okay, but then symptoms increase at a later date. And then our chronic folks who start off high and then don't see their symptoms go down. So those are the 4 main ones that we see pretty consistently across disasters. The good news is we see it across disaster types, across research studies. Most people after a disaster will fall into the resilient category, upwards of 2/3. Usually it's about 60 to 70% of folks will show either no or minimal symptoms of emotional distress, post-traumatic stress after a disaster. Minimal does not mean none, and it doesn't mean there can't be a pretty quick spike in symptoms, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but that most folks really do okay to the tune of 60 to 70%. The next most common group are our recovery folks. These are folks who maybe start off with some pretty high symptoms early on, but they go down over time and they stay down. That's to the tune of about 20% of those folks, or of people will fall into that recovery trajectory. Then we have folks who fall into the chronic or delayed category. Each of those are roughly 10% or less will fall into the chronic or the delayed onset category. And so that gives some good news because in the aftermath of a disaster, it can feel very overwhelming especially when your community is hit. And there can be a lot of worry about like how are folks gonna recover from this? And the answer is they do pretty well. Most folks, not all, but most. Something to point out, children, when we've looked at those trajectories, they show 3 primary trajectories. Similar to adults, most children will fall into a resilient trajectory, meaning they show low or minimal symptoms early on that quickly dissipate and then stay low. Similarly, we also see a recovery trajectory, high symptoms at the beginning, but they go down over time and stay down. And we do see a chronic trajectory where some children have symptoms that are high at the beginning and stay high. Just like adults, those ratios tend to stay about the same. Most are resilient. Next highest are that recovery trajectory. Third then is that chronic piece, and it tends to be a small number of children. We do not see a delayed trajectory consistently with kids, meaning I interpret that as they don't try to hold it together. You see the symptoms early on versus kind of, oh, are they trying to hold it together? And then later on we see more symptoms appear. So then we look at, well, what predicts who goes into which category? And the answer is some things. This is actually a little bit trickier. There are some protective factors that we know of for both adults and children, the biggest one being perceived social support. So in adults, that's reporting that they have family, close friends, a significant other, folks like that, that are there to support them. Children, it's usually like, do they have family, teachers, peers that they can connect with? And that's a big source of protection and resilience for adults and children. In adults, there are some personality traits, characteristics, though we'll talk about that, that do seem to be predictive. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those are. So some kind of internal characteristics that they're just hardy and they have these characteristics and that makes them resilient. In children who have better developed coping skills, that tends to be predictive of better outcomes. We do also know that there are several risk factors, and we know more about risk factors than we do protective factors. A number of demographic characteristics, things like minority status. In adults, we don't see necessarily a gender difference, though in children we do see that girls are a little bit higher rate of symptoms post-disaster than boys. Things like lower income, lower education level, those types of demographics tend to predict poorer outcomes. And then we look at disaster-related exposure and stressors. So their experiences during the disaster. Some of the ones that happen there, loss of loved ones, so the severity of the disaster, loss of a pet, that came out of Hurricane Katrina research because at the time, evacuating pets was not priority. A lot of folks had to leave their pets behind, and we have since found that that's a big predictor of emotional distress after the disaster. Loss of property. Witnessing in children, witnessing injury, witnessing especially caregiver be injured or struggle after the disaster. Relocation, so having to move to a new place or get a new job, having to move to a new school, and then things like past history of stressful events, which if you've been on our Lunch and Learns, we talk so much about complex trauma, early adversity, ACEs, that cumulative exposure over time holds true with disaster research quite consistently as well. Combination of risk factors in adults. Children, we see history of anxiety, exposure to community violence, also predictive of subsequent difficulty after disaster. So talking about resilience, because really a lot of times after disasters, we immediately start throwing around the term resilient. Who's going to be resilient? Are we resilient? How do we be resilient? And I'm not going to try to get too deep into this because the answer is, well, that's complicated. And actually, there's a lot of things we still don't know about what predicts who will be resilient. We got a couple predictors, but not a lot. Usually when we're talking about individuals who are resilient after disaster, that is usually looking at those trajectories that we talked about. And it's usually about folks who did not show a lot of symptoms. They didn't have a lot of psychopathology after the disaster. But it's like, well, is that really what resilience is? Is just, well, you didn't get a diagnosis from it? Okay, that seems like there should be more to that. And we know that there are folks who show growth after disaster. It's not consistently shown, but there are these experiences and anecdotes of folks who they step up and they become more or have post-traumatic growth after the disaster. So absence of psychopathology is one way. It doesn't really explain like what is resilience, but that is one way we measure it. We do also try to look at like, are there characteristics in folks that just make them resilient? They are just hardy people. And this came out of research, really kind of more in the education realm, about a term called grit. And you may have heard this term of grit. And it was used to describe internal characteristics of persistence in the face of difficulty and sort of emotional stability in the face of difficulty. And trying to figure out, do those characteristics play out in disaster literature? And actually, George Bonanno, who does these disaster trajectories, he is very critical of the resilient personality kind of model. Because what he argues is when you actually try to measure that resilient personality, things like grit, hardiness, perseverance, and you actually go and measure how folks who have that characteristic before they experience a stressor and then measure it after they've experienced a stressor, there's not actually much of a connection there. The examples that he gives, the studies he's looked at, are things like studies looking at soldiers who are in basic training, measuring this characteristic before they're deployed, and then measuring their functioning after they've been deployed. We don't actually see a strong correlation there. Same with police officers. So cadets in training, police cadets, they've done some of these studies. What characteristics do they have as measured when they're cadets, and then does that predict their functioning over time? And the answer is not really, or it's very small. And then what Bonanno argues is this idea of, well, it's not just a personality, it's the ability to adapt to a specific situation. He calls that flexible adaptation. And so he has created this picture that you see on the right side of the slide, where he kind of has this two-part model of how resilience occurs after a disaster. And it's a little bit complex, and I kind of don't understand it myself, but basically what he says is, you have folks who do have this flexible mindset. So that's a little bit of that kind of internal flexible mindset. That includes things like coping self-efficacy. I know I can manage this. I can manage difficult things. Optimism. Things will work out for me, even if it's difficult now. And challenge appraisal. That's the idea of when faced with a challenge, instead of viewing it as something to avoid, something that's bad, something that's a failure, you view it as something to take on, and you can do it and you can solve it. And so he says, we have that type of mindset in an individual, but then we also have how their ability to apply that mindset in a specific situation. So that's where you get things like context sensitivity. So did they realize that they needed to use their flexible mindset in this situation? So they can evaluate the demands. Okay, here's the problem, and here's how I'm going to fix it. Here's how I'm going to solve it and get through it. Repertoire. For every stressful event, how you solve that will be different. How you respond, for instance, in a tornado is different than how you respond in a flood. So the skills you need to navigate those and other stressful or traumatic events vary widely depending on the situation. So he says, part of it is, do they have the necessary skills for that situation? So not just the mindset, but the actual skills to navigate that. And also, are they responsive to feedback? So if they try to do something, they have the sensitivity, they know there's a problem, they have the skills to solve the problem. Are they sensitive to recognize if what they're doing is working? If not, do they respond to feedback and fix it and change it? So that, he says, is this motivational and mechanistic components of regulatory flexibility. A lot of big words. Where, yes, we think resilience is both a mindset and an ability to act effectively in the given situation. Questions on that? Because I probably can't answer them, but let me know if you have questions on that. And I need to pull up my chat for a moment to see that. It's here. So, okay. Moving on. Thank you for letting me talk about, well, we're going to talk about just a little bit more research, and then we'll get to kind of more practical stuff. So that's at the individual level. What makes an individual resilient? But really, with disaster work, we also look at what makes a community resilient, because that's the reality of disaster work. Is it's not the individual, that it is not only the individual that's being impacted, it's also the community at large, and that adds another layer of how we respond and support folks. So a couple different quick models that I'll talk about, just so you kind of have some of the lingo that you might hear in the community resilience world. There's many ways they talk about resilience. One way that we talk about community resilience are kind of this kind of three tiers of resilience: reactive, responsive, and proactive. So reactive resilience is the ability to respond and recover to the immediate situation, the immediate disaster, or bounce back from the disaster. The idea being that resilience reflects the ability to get houses repaired, get kids back into school, get the infrastructure rebuilt, and return to pre-disaster functioning. And that resilience is demonstrated when that is done successfully. But we're starting to move a little bit beyond that, because especially with what we see with disasters and current climate events, is returning back to the status quo may actually set us up for future challenge, for future threats. Or not set us up well, I should say, for future threats. It may set us up for another disaster. And so then there's this idea of responsive resilience. And this is the idea of kind of learning from the threats, learning from the damage, and mitigating those risks. Examples are, if a house was in a flood zone that flooded, moving it to higher ground. If it's being rebuilt, rebuilding in higher ground, reinforcing housing with earthquake resistant infrastructure. Alaska does actually, there's a little bit reactive but responsive. They can, when they are prone to earthquakes, and when their earthquakes happen, they can damage roads pretty regularly, and they get in there so quick. They will have those roads repaired within a week. I mean, it's just like, okay, and they've got a plan for that. They know how to respond to that type of disaster. Like, it just doesn't really slow them down much. So that's an idea of responsive resilience, taking lessons learned and changing so that you are not as high risk if that disaster occurs again, or that event occurs again. And that's, there's a lot of thought and action around that. And then there's kind of the sort of third wave of what they call proactive resilience, which this is that anticipation of future weather events or future disaster events. So these are things like creating incentives to increase plants and trees in urban areas to create green spaces to offset what they call heat islands. So we know in dense urban areas, those areas are more prone to high temperatures above and beyond the surrounding climate and geology, because of the dense nature of concrete and artificial materials. And so there's been movements to incentivize increasing green space in these dense urban areas to offset that heat island. Also, we look at things like farming practices that change to reflect changing climate variability. In disasters like hurricanes, instead of just trying to build higher seawalls to prevent erosion and sand and from being washed back out to sea, is building, allowing for more I'm blanking on the word, more green space, more swampland that helps absorb the tidal surges. Because the water's got to go somewhere. Let's give it a space to go. So that's the idea with proactive resilience. So those are how we define it. When we look at, well, how do we build that? How do we get that going, that type of resilience going? One of the big areas is a term they call social capital. And this is the links between individuals and groups that bring resources and support and ideas to models of resilience. And there they usually will talk about bonding networks. So these are closely linked high affinity groups. So when disaster strikes, most likely the first person you're going to reach out to is a loved one or somebody you have a close relationship with for your support. And we know having those bonding groups is very important to resilience. Bridging social capital or social networks are groups that are less affinity, but have some sort of underlying relationship. So this usually involves networks of like coworkers, networks of, it might be a community organization you belong to, churches, your school, which are networks that you may not be super close to, but you have a relationship with, and they provide novel resources. So while your family may provide you that emotional support that you need and some physical and financial help, you may reach out to your place of employment because the place of employment offers EAP, offers free mental health resources, and you can get connected to mental health resources through your work. Or it may be there is a school fundraiser for disaster relief, and so you connect with the school to get those resources through the school. And so those are both considered like horizontal networks in that there's usually fairly equal power across those networks. Unique resources, but equal power. Then we talk about linking social capital, which are what they call vertical networks. So this is the ability to link into like nonprofits, executive leadership, federal resources, groups that hold greater power or financial resources to provide support. So those are things like, Red Cross, FEMA, state agencies that come in after disaster. And so the idea is these types of networks, when we have strong support across these different types of networks, we tend to see more resilience. And the appeal of this model is that these are things we can look at proactively. We can look at these in a community and say, do you have these types of networks? If not, how do we start to build those in to help you be resilient? Okay, so that's an overview of like, what does resilience look like at the community level? None of that. Let's get into, oops, excuse me, move my slides around. I will pause for a second if there are any thoughts, questions, redirections. All right, so that's talking about, what does resilience look like? Who tends to fall into those categories? Now we're going to shift to, what about folks that struggle? What does that look like? We talked about most folks will be resilient. But even in folks who are resilient, that doesn't mean there's no response, there's no reaction. And that's what we're going to talk about first. But also, what about those folks who show a stronger reaction or a longer reaction? And what does that look like? So in the immediate minutes, hours, up to days, few days, individuals who have been exposed to disaster may show what they call an acute stress reaction. That is not the same as an acute stress disorder. Though symptoms may look similar, an acute stress reaction are emotional symptoms that present minutes may present minutes up to days after the event. Usually they only last a few days. The big symptoms we tend to see are autonomic arousal. So that means your body's really amped, really pumped, big emotions happening. You may see the opposite, dissociative symptoms. So folks tuning out, being withdrawn, not really responding effectively or appropriately in the situation. Changes in mood or anxiety, emotional arousal, so big emotions, kind of big moods, teariness, anger. Changes in activity level. This could be restlessness. They can't sit still. They can't relax. They can't chill out. Or it could be under arousal. They're not moving. They're not talking. They're not being very active, and social withdrawal. So you can kind of see some big extremes there. Overactivation and sort of underactivation. However, these responses are actually considered normal in that they are not considered pathologic. They're not considered a diagnosable disorder. It's considered part of the stress response to a threat. And so while they may need support, they are not considered like a mental health disorder. However, if those types of symptoms persist, especially beyond, usually it's like 3 days, then we start thinking of an acute stress disorder. And that is very similar symptoms, but may also include like they can't get thoughts of the disaster out of their head, even when they're trying to sleep. They're having nightmares. The thoughts keep coming back into their head. Their thoughts are overwhelming. Those are intrusive symptoms. Persistent negative mood. Nothing's going to work out. This is hopeless. I can't believe this has happened to me. My life will never be okay. Dissociation, so checking out, not responding to the world around them. Avoidance, just refusing to acknowledge, go near, be around anything that reminds them of the event. And arousal, so just like their body's amped, they are just on edge, those types of things. So in the immediate aftermath of a disaster, you may see these, and again, like that may not mean they're going to have a long-term mental health disorder. That's just kind of part of the reaction sometimes. What we usually see is those go down pretty quickly. If they don't, we consider that an acute stress disorder. Not going to go to the next slide. Longer term, what we start to look for is more kind of traditional mental health diagnoses, the big one being PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So usually we don't diagnose PTSD until at least 1 month has passed with symptoms present. Those can include, the big categories are intrusive symptoms, thoughts coming into their head, feeling like they're re-experiencing the event, avoidance of people, places, or things that remind them of the event, negative alterations in cognition or mood, so just a really negative mood or mindset, that sense of like hopelessness, guilt, blame, things like that. And then those alterations in arousal and reactivity. So appearing on edge, being easily startled, being irritable, having anger outbursts. Those symptoms, when we see those persisting at least a month, start to fall under that category of PTSD. Now that's often, when we think of trauma, that's usually the diagnosis we jump to, but we see after disasters, there are other diagnoses that need to be considered, including things like anxiety, depression, substance use disorders. What we find is that those who were at most risk before, so those who had a pre-existing anxiety disorder, mood disorder, whatever, are at higher risk of that anxiety disorder either increasing or reappearing after a disaster. And that's, the shorthand is how you were doing the day before the disaster is a big predictor of how you will do the day after a disaster. And so exacerbation of previous mental health conditions is one of the biggest responses we see in folks who struggle after disaster. Developmental considerations. So that was talking broadly, kind of especially about adults, but I always like to take a little bit of time to talk about, well, what does that look like in kids? In young children, the challenge is they may have limited verbal memory, or the ability to recognize the link between their experience and their symptoms. So they have a hard time saying, I'm feeling scared because this happened, because I went through this disaster. And they may not make that connection. All they know is they're not happy. Life is not good. And so then we are dependent on observation of their behavior. So things that we may see in young children who've experienced a disaster are the more general changes in behavior. So they're fussier, they're more clingy. They seem to be worried about a lot of things more than they used to worry about. We may also see developmental regression. So pottying, toilet training suddenly regresses. Speech even, in young children learning how to speak, they're not speaking as much, or they resort to baby talk or immature speech that they had previously had moved through. We may also see traumatic play. Now, always caution when we talk about traumatic play, there's a difference between traumatic play and play used to process a stressful or traumatic event. So, children often try to understand their environment by demonstrating it through their play. That is developmentally appropriate. You can see that when a child undergoes a stressful event, it may show up in their play, and that's not inherently bad. That is how they may process it. So sometimes we see things like when a pet dies, and they're demonstrating like a funeral in their play, or they're demonstrating, reactions around the pet dying and that sort of thing. That's not inherently bad. When we talk about traumatic play, what we talk about is play around trauma that is not resolved or creates intense negative emotions. So this is getting stuck. If they witnessed flooding, and they're demonstrating flooding in their play, but they're becoming more dysregulated with it, or more upset, or they can't move on and show resolution of that. Like, oh, then the EMS people came, the rescue people came and they helped us out, and then we were safe. They don't resolve that, they get stuck in it. And that's traumatic play, and that can be a sign of a child that's struggling after a traumatic event like a disaster. For our school-age children, we may still see some of the things we saw with the younger ones, but what we start to see more so is like concerns about safety of self and others. So separation anxiety, school avoidance. They don't want to go to school because they don't want to be either away from home or away from a caregiver. Sometimes it's about, I need to be at my house to be safe, and sometimes it's, I just need to be with my caregiver to be safe. Or they might get hurt, worries about the caregiver being hurt, that are above and beyond what you would expect. Somatic symptoms, so tummy aches, headaches, playing sick, not feeling good, feeling tired more than usual. Attention problems, we have to be careful about labeling things as ADHD when it may be distractibility due to worrying about what happened to them. Worrying about what may happen to them in the future. And then the associated academic decline, especially in the school setting. And then sleep and appetite changes. So too much sleep, too little sleep, too much appetite, too little appetite. These are all things that we may see. For adolescents, the big things that we look out for, depending on the maturity of the adolescent and their where they are developmentally, their responses may resemble adult responses. So some of those symptoms we talked about as kind of the PTSD classic symptoms. But we do tend to see higher rates of like self-destructive or aggressive behavior, so self-injury, lashing out, thoughts of violence or aggression towards the perceived perpetrator in the situation, kind of revenge mindset. We also see adolescents in general are more prone to being self-conscious or self-absorbed about their role or their how they are perceived, the spotlight effect. Everybody is looking at me, everybody is watching me. And this can lead after disaster to perceptions of I'm going crazy, I'm all alone in this, nobody else understands how I feel about this. That can become unhelpful. And then, yeah, fantasies of revenge or about like being able to fix it, getting stuck on somehow that they could have prevented or fixed this, made it better, made it not happen, get back at the perceived kind of perpetrator or situation. A couple of when we talk about supporting individuals after a disaster, this is kind of our PSA for secondary traumatic stress and things like burnout. So some unique considerations about supporting individuals and the community after a disaster. One is, and this is especially if you are part of that community, challenge with a disaster, a traumatic disaster is oftentimes the supports that would normally be there to help the individual recover from a trauma are also disrupted. So things like schools being closed for a long period of time after disaster. Around here in Carter County, the mental health agency was closed. The DCS office was closed for a while. So those access to normal resources and supports that you would bank on may not be there. And that adds a level of stress and risk after a disaster. The overlap of professional and personal roles, and this applies, I'm gonna guess with 100% of people who are attending this call. For those of us who are professionals that support those who are impacted by trauma and disasters, it is very tricky and has to be watched very carefully about balancing your professional role and response with your personal role and response in a disaster, because when a disaster hits, it impacts you too. And that can create sort of added stress and burden to you as you are trying to engage in your professional role. And professional role could be very simple. If you are a teacher in a disaster impacted area, you just have a job in an impacted area where you interact with other humans, and you're trying to support them. It's your neighbors. You're trying to support your neighbors because they were impacted and you were impacted too. And this was something we saw with the Hurricane Helene response, was individuals were very reluctant to describe themselves as victims, but were eager to engage in the helping role. Oh, it's not me. I'm okay. We had some damage. I'm okay. I'm okay. It's my neighbor. It's, this community. It's not me. It's them. And then what we would, find out or observe is like they were also struggling. They were impacted too. And so helping individuals who wanted to be helpers, which can be a source of strength and a source of resilience, but when it's at the expense of their own well-being and their own needs, that can then become a risk factor and can become a burden. And it's just that overall risk of burnout, especially in disaster work. So that slide that I showed from FEMA, the National Recovery Framework, it's so easy and so seductive to get pulled into giving everything you can to help those who are in need, while not recognizing that you're burning yourself out. And we saw that, it's just folks who were staying up. I mean, just working literally 24/7, without sleep, without regular meals, without checking in with their own family, and quickly, recognizing that was not sustainable. So those are some things when you are working in a disaster impacted area to consider. So what are interventions to support folks after disasters? In the immediate days and weeks after disaster, certainly a number of folks would come up and be like, oh, I think this person needs therapy. Where can they get therapy? They need therapy. And the actual answer is immediately post-disaster, therapy is not the first intervention you would think of, or not the first intervention to put out there. For a couple of reasons. One, we talked about even folks who have maybe an initial strong reaction after disaster, a lot of those folks, their emotions quickly return to normal. And so by the time you engage them in therapy, they're doing okay. And so trying to jump in and grab those folks immediately isn't going to be very effective, because they may not actually need that level of support long term. Two, in the immediate aftermath of the disaster, a lot of folks are really just trying to find shelter, food, and get their lives in a semblance of a routine, and get back to stability. And so adding on an outpatient therapy appointment, even if it is telehealth or even if it is in the field, is just too much. And so therapy often is too much in that moment. And what we find is that it's just not really necessary. We don't have to go to that level. We can do some other things. And so the post-disaster interventions that have been developed really focus on supporting families around identifying what works for them. So instead of trying to add new therapy, add new skills, it's connecting them to what works, connecting them to what used to work, connecting them to the supports they need to manage their well-being. So the sort of initial intervention after disaster, one is called psychological first aid, or PFA. And some of you folks may have seen us advertise that last fall. Psychological first aid is usually administered in days to weeks after the disaster. So it's that kind of first short-term response. And then after that is what they call skills for psychological recovery. This is a little bit more intense, and I'll go through each of these. Skills for psychological recovery is in the weeks to months after a disaster, a little bit further down the line. It's not the first thing out the door, it's a little bit later. And then another intervention is respond with care. This, similarly to SPR, is a little bit down the road. And this is specific for adults and children, adults who work with children and supporting children. It's not necessarily meant for the immediate aftermath of a disaster. It's a little bit down the line. Then, kind of a little bit later, we might consider outpatient therapy. More months, weeks to months. And let me specify, especially for those who did not already have an outpatient therapist. Now, if they already had an outpatient therapist and need to reconnect with them, that's different. So what are they? So psychological first aid, or PFA. The goals of PFA are to reduce immediate distress. Let's get folks calmed down, stabilized. Help them engage in their own coping skills, so find what works for them to help them cope, and encourage self-empowerment. Help them get a plan together about next steps. And so you see there's sort of 8 components to psychological first aid. So contact and engagement, safety and comfort, stabilization, information gathering, practical assistance, connection with social supports, information on coping, and linkage with collaborative services. This is not a formula. It's not meant to be you have to do one step at a time or you only go in order. It's saying, these are different areas that may need to be targeted. So there's no formula for it. It's just these are 8 areas to evaluate and problem solve with the person who's impacted and help them decide where they need to focus on. PFA is meant to be administered in the field, so directly to disaster impacted individuals wherever they are. So PFA is administered in, evacuation camps, in, resource centers, donation centers, wherever. It doesn't have to be done in an office, and it does not have to be administered by a mental health professional. It is not considered mental health. And so while many people who engage PFA and provide PFA are mental health providers, it's meant to be for anybody who is frontline disaster work. So churches, volunteer organizations, first responders, the whole thing. And so it is developed so that you don't have to have a mental health background to be able to implement PFA. Skills for psychological recovery, so kind of that next step out. The goals of SPR are to protect the mental health of those impacted by a disaster or emergency, enhance their ability to address needs and concerns, and start to teach skills that promote recovery and adaptive behavior. Now, this is not meant to treat a mental health disorder. It is meant to help sort of maximize resilience, maximize coping in an effort to prevent the escalation of mental health symptoms. It does have a little bit more emphasis on teaching skills, where PFA, there's a little bit about it, but it's more about identifying skills they already have. Skills for psychological recovery is a little bit more, there's more emphasis on teaching skills, but it is still about engaging the person in the supports that they have and the resources that they have. And so similarly, there's not a formula you have to follow. You don't have to go in a certain order. It's about establishing a goal with the person, the individual, at whatever level, and then offering them supports and strategies around that goal. And so that's the little cycle that you see of information and prioritizing, problem solving skills, positive activities, managing reactions, helpful thinking, healthy connections. It's not expected that you'll go through all of these. You may just go through one, and that's cool. It's meant to be modular and flexible. Also meant to be administered by non-mental health professionals. And then respond with care. So some of y'all that know us pretty well have probably heard of CARE, Child-Adult Relationship Enhancement. And this is an intervention for any adult that works with any child. They have modified that CARE to have more of a disaster trauma lens to it. And so the goals of CARE are to work with an adult to teach them skills for how to support a child that they're working with, whether that's parent, teacher, first responder, whatever. And it provides information on developmental responses to disasters and emergencies. So, expectations for how kids are going to respond in an emergency. Teaches skills for increasing positive interactions between adults and children using therapeutic play skills. Increases compliance to adult instruction and how to give good commands. And can decrease mild to moderate problematic behaviors and emotional reactions. Now, to unlike PFA and SPR, the facilitator who is teaching these skills will usually be a mental health provider. They will have mental health training. Now, uh, who they train to have the skills is just any adult who works with kids. So it's not meant to be a therapy. It doesn't have to be with a care, like a parent figure to a child. It can be teacher, first responder, whoever. But this does require a higher level of training to teach these skills than SPR or PFA. All right. Any questions about those before I kind of wind us up? We've got about 15 more minutes. I'm going to talk just a little bit about the Washington County Long-Term Recovery Group and then sort of next steps. Checking my chat. Okay. All right. So I introduced, that I'm the vice chair of the Spiritual and Emotional Wellbeing Committee of the Washington County Long-Term Recovery Groups. This is the Long-Term Recovery Group is a kind of spokes and wheel model. So there's a sort of a program committee in the middle that is, we have a program manager and then like government officials and some of the bigger nonprofits that are sort of organizing this, the organizing structure. And then we have these subcommittees. And the committees are on things like construction, debris removal, legal advocacy, donation drop-offs, volunteer coordination, and then like an unmet needs, like and everything else. And then there's the Spiritual and Emotional Wellbeing Committee, which I said was mental health, churches, and then community members who wanted to support those efforts. So, it's really been a very interesting experience because I am new to this area, relatively speaking, to Washington County. I moved from Kansas City. And so it has been an opportunity to really engage at the community level on the recovery needs. And it's been a variety of recovery efforts that we have engaged in. So we were able to put on trainings for PFA, SPR, and have some care trainings. Frontier Mental Health is our big community mental health provider. They have been engaged and have case management and mental health providers who have dedicated time to those impacted by the disaster. And then there's been these more sort of community-based projects just to increase engagement and well-being. And so some of those you'll see there were so many donations that came in to several of the churches in the area. South Central Elementary, they developed a book. Their fourth graders developed a book about their experiences after the disaster called South Central Strong, and they each got to write an essay and draw some pictures related to it, and then they self-published it. And then we helped organize a big book signing for them. So to bring attention to their efforts at the recovery. There was a lot of outpouring of volunteer support from the local churches and from out-of-state churches and organizations coming in. That has been really powerful and has been a big help in addition to our more traditional supports like FEMA and Red Cross and those sorts of folks, like being able to step in and help where there were gaps in some of the needs that FEMA and folks could not provide for. So that's been a neat experience. We are planning an anniversary commemoration that will be coming up on Saturday, September 27th. That will have a religious service and a meal and then a commemoration event down at the Nolichucky River, which is where a lot of the flooding happened. But as we approach this anniversary, how do we know who still needs help? First, we want to start looking at, going back to that slide where I showed the recovery phases, looking at those gaps as we're entering that long-term phase and sort of, who got left in the lurch there. Being aware of anniversary events. So that can be things like the anniversary, but also it can be things like missed birthdays, missed trips that were anticipated and were unable to happen. Returning to school, we've been watching that a little bit, those changes in routine that were around the time of the event. So being aware of those types of events, being on the lookout for folks who may still have trauma specific symptoms, but also being aware of the fact of those folks who may have more general symptoms and who may have been struggling prior to the disaster, and this was an additional stressor. And so those are usually the folks I start to think about, and that's that ACEs mentality of like that cumulative impact of trauma and stress and experience over time. So looking at those pre-existing risk factors, looking more broadly beyond just, do I think they have PTSD or not? Am I seeing folks still struggling with a lot of anxiety or really struggling with their mood, really struggling with substance use? They were doing pretty well. They're really struggling. Still, they started struggling again. Some ways to enter into the conversation, and I won't go too much into this. There's a public health program called How's Your Five? And I just came across this this past year. It started after the Joplin tornadoes as a disaster response, but it has since been adopted as just a public health response of how do you engage folks in that conversation about how they're doing. And it says, let's get beyond just fine. I'm doing fine. Let's get beyond that. And so the How's Your Five is a way of asking, how's work going? How or school with children. How are you getting along with your friends? How are you getting along with your spouse? How are you getting along with your family members? How, you doing anything fun? You got anything fun going on in your life? How is it going with positive activities? How's your sleep? How's your appetite? And by looking at these more broad considerations, a lot of times we start that conversation of, well, things are still pretty rough at work, or I'm still looking for a job. I lost my job after the disaster and I'm still struggling to find one, or still struggling to find enough work, or finances are tight, or if there's fighting or conflict. And so the How's Your Five, it now has actually been spread through the Mercy Hospital system, which is in South Louisiana as well. And so it's just a way of folks entering into a conversation about how you're doing day to day. And it started as a way of asking folks impacted by disasters, like, how are you actually doing? And does that lead to more conversation about needs, unmet needs? What can help? Educate on trauma responses. You've learned today kind of the many ways that folks respond in a disaster. Most will be okay, some will not. Those responses can look pretty broad. Help individuals and families connect to what works. That was the goal of PFA and SPR is don't try to introduce new when they may have the ability to recover. Let's see if we can connect them to those supports. So things like connecting folks to routines, enjoyable activities, positive interactions between family members, supportive caregivers, supportive resources in the community. Those are all things that can help families still recovering from the disaster, help them move forward. But what if they need more? Then we start talking about outpatient therapy. Then we start talking about, if we're seeing those PTSD symptoms persist, now is definitely the time to be talking about mental health resources. And these are some examples for adults and children. Key takeaways. What should you have learned today? Most children and families will do okay after a disaster. Sometimes it does not feel like that in the immediate hours and days after a disaster. It feels very overwhelming, but what we see is most families are resilient. Consider the broader picture of functioning to determine level of need. Consider that how's your five? How's work, school, play, love going? Certain personality characteristics, such as a flexible mindset and access to social support, can promote a resilient recovery. That's that return to what works sometimes. But we still have to keep an eye out on it. There's the whole thing about the double-edged sword of social support. Good social support is great. Bad social support is terrible. Social support can sometimes be a mixed bag, but there are certain characteristics, and that access to social support often is a big help to families. And then, of course, especially as we're anticipating the anniversary, there are no fixed time points in healing. Healing is nonlinear, it doesn't always go straight down, and it has no end date. And this is really to reflect upon what we've learned over the past 20, 30 years. While most families do okay, it can be a powerful change after disaster that impacts folks for a very long time. And sometimes there's this belief that it's too late. I can't get better. Robin Gurwitch, one of the big disaster psychologists, was talking about the Oklahoma City bombings. We had the 30th anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombings, and she was present in Oklahoma when those happened, and that spurred her career in disaster research. And she said she met a gentleman, a grandfather, who was present at the Oklahoma City bombings or in the area, and he said, I feel like it's just too late for me. And that's just not true. Healing can happen at any time point. It is never too late. There's not an expiration date on healing. So these are some resources, things that I talked about. I will stop sharing. I believe Caleb has posted the survey and my slides. So if you want those resources, the slides are there. Any questions? We got five minutes. I think Caleb will share the slides for you, and that resource slide is in the PDF. So thank you all very much for taking the time to come to our Lunch and Learn. Caleb, do we know what our topic is for next month?
Yes. No, yeah. Thank you so much for presenting on this. Next month, our topic is going to be complex trauma and early childhood development. And it will be Dr. Liz Gamble and Melissa Hoffman, I believe, who will be presenting that next month in October. So come back and join us again.